Remember when the only way of finding out what was going on in the world was via the morning paper? Depending on your age, maybe you don't. Such a time did exist, but since the dawn of the internet and the smartphone, it's a new world. One where we can find out what's happening both near and far at the click of a button. We're inundated with information, but is the way we get our news always morally sound? Welcome back to Explained, the Southampton Solent University podcast where we attempt to unpack what's going on behind the scenes of modern life, from sport and science to music and law and everything in between. I'm your host, Robyn and this week we're exploring the changing world of journalism while diving into preserving journalistic integrity. Today I'm joined by Senior Lecturer Sport Journalism, Andy Ford. As a qualified journalist, Andy has more than 30 years' experience across national and regional print and online media, as well as in radio and television, including ITV and Sky Sports. At Solent, Andy teaches aspiring sports journalists, guiding them towards successful careers in journalism. Welcome, Andy.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. I've got some bad news for you straight away.
Okay, go on.
It's not 30 years, it's 40.
It's 40 years?
I know,
oh
scary.
Oh my goodness, so you really know your stuff.
I don't know about that, it just means I'm really old.
That's not true. Or maybe it is, I don't know. So I want to begin by setting the scene.
Okay.
So, as you say, you've worked in journalism for 40 years, so you've seen a huge amount of change. News used to be slow and centralised, morning paper, evening bulletin, and obviously those things still do exist. People still do buy the paper, less people than before, and people still watch the evening news. As we were speaking about before this, I was watching the 6 o'clock news last night. But in this internet age, the rise of the 24-hour cycle, along with falling circulations, mean there's pressure to get more news out and quicker. So I guess one of the first things I want to ask you about that is there an issue of trust in journalism now? Because just this week, Mark Zuckerberg has announced that he's no longer investing in fact checkers on Facebook. So I guess there's two questions here. One of them is, in your 40 years, what do you feel has been very significant for you as a journalist? And are we now in a time where we do have to be quite concerned about, news being unreliable? First
and foremost, I think there's always been a desire for news to be delivered quickly. The internet has obviously enabled that, and social media has enabled that to come, as you say, straight to our smartphones. But don't be fooled into thinking that the demand for quick turnaround of news hasn't always existed. It has. Yes, of course, we used to get our news from national, regional papers. We also used to get it from radio stations and TV broadcasts going back decades and decades, even before I started being a journalist, which we've already established is far too long ago. If you imagine a time where regional newspapers printed several editions per day, and I'm talking 4 or 5 editions per day, these were sold on street corners by people. The news was constantly updated. So slow journalism, which is what I think you're sort of edging towards here, is not a new concept, but also the desire to quickly turn things around and deliver stuff to people is also not a new concept. Just because the internet makes it straight into our pockets on our smartphones, it's not a new concept at all. In terms of kind of reputationally and integrity and things like that, the name you mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, one of the things I throw straight back at you is this. Is Facebook journalism?
Well, that would be a question I'd throw straight back to you.
It's like a game of tennis, this.
Yeah, I mean, when I was researching for this episode, I don't think traditionally it's journalism, but I think people do go to social media to get their news, and it's not always from a particularly reliable source.
No, so we need to drill down into this a wee bit and kind of establish some parameters here. Let's say, for the sake of argument, your washing machine goes wrong, okay?
Yeah.
You know a friend who says that they know a bit about washing machines, and you ask them to come in and fix your broken washing machine. They wander in with their, in inverted commas, expertise. They go about fixing your washing machine and leave it in a worse state than you found it. The person I'm talking about is not a qualified washing machine engineer. If you want the job done properly, you get a washing machine engineer in, don't you? What's happened with journalism these last decades is that lots of people say they're journalists, but actually are not.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really, really important distinction. You wouldn't ask somebody who's a non-expert to deliver a product, storytelling, which is what journalists do, without a level of expertise and experience and qualification. So, yeah, you can say, I'm a journalist, I publish my stuff on Facebook, I wrote this thing.
Yeah.
But does that really make you a journalist? The whole industry has changed face completely because of social media, because of Facebook, because of Twitter, because of what's gone on our smartphones. And I think what's happened is mostly journalism is populated by dinosaurs like me, who have kind of seen all this stuff overtake us. The industry is trying to catch up and is doing it really, really badly. Integrity is a massive deal, and honesty is a massive deal. And I think lots of journalists have suffered as a result of being tarred with the same brush as people who are not qualified to do the job that we as qualified people do.
Yeah. And is that something that you yourself do find concerning, the fact that, people are consuming their news from sources that aren't really trained or don't have that background, that foundation behind them of expertise to deliver the news in a way that is, unbiased and reliable?
One of the words you've already used and I've used today is integrity. I think to have integrity, what you have to have is honesty. What you tend to find in lots of social media platforms and other stuff actually, is that people go into the desire to publish something, to actually have their words written down and shown to others with an agenda. Whatever that agenda is, it can be anything, can't it? It could be, you could be talking about what's going on in the Ukraine. You could be talking about the wildfires in the States. You could be talking about lots of inflammatory, difficult subjects. If you go into that with an agenda, trying to push your own agenda, does that mean you have integrity or not? What a journalist does, a proper journalist, is they see every story has two sides. And it's our job to investigate both of those two sides. What people who are untrained do is go one way. They push that agenda and they ignore the other half of it because, we are all human beings. You have a view on something and you come up on a story which differs with your own personal opinion. What you have to do as a good journalist is put that down, ignore that, and go the way that you should do, which is to give the story balance.
With that in mind, and going back slightly to what you said about the industry being a little bit behind, BBC introduced Verify, and that's where they kind of tackle these fake news issues, or these, particularly during the US election, they were doing a lot of pieces to say, actually, this isn't accurate, or
the fact-checking stuff.
Yeah, and I think when we were talking about the wildfires, people could be on the ground in LA with their smartphone, taking pictures and then posting them online, or they might not even be in LA. It raises that question of trust, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and that's where good journalism comes into its own, because part of the role of a good journalist is to check stuff to make sure it comes from where you think it comes from. So what you're talking about. Using the example of people on the ground in those horrendous LA fires, they're not journalists. Some of them might be, but they're contributors. They're people on the ground. And as long as you establish that when you're telling people, you're giving people that information and showing it to them, then that's the correct way to go. You read stuff about, in inverted commas, citizen journalists, which is an interesting definition. The first time I heard that definition, it made my blood run cold, to be honest. They might call themselves a citizen journalist because they're exploring issues in their local community, whatever they might be. But they're untrained, they're not legally qualified, they don't know about balance, they don't know about good storytelling, they don't understand the implications of what they're writing, how it can impact other people. You have to make sure that people like that have their right place in the overall picture of delivering information. And as long as you, a viewer or reader, understand where your information is coming from my perspective, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the people in LA. If you know that that's, a contributor who lives in number 27 who happens to have a smartphone and got some great pictures, then that's absolutely fine. So it's about qualifying what you're seeing or hearing or reading and giving it a correct, the correct weighting, I suppose.
Well, I was about to ask actually, do people know? Do people know that what they're seeing on social media isn't, expert journalism? Do you think that's a risk, that people just don't realise that what they're consuming isn't actually proper journalism?
Yes, it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
And I think the majority of people, I would suggest, would understand what they're reading is, where it comes from. Some won't. People are intelligent enough to work this stuff out. And I think we are flooded with very one-sided stuff these days on social media. Let's talk about, I've talked a little bit about how journalistic integrity is important. In the same sort of stratosphere as that, you've got tabloid newspapers who traditionally, for decades, and I've worked for them, they push the envelope, they take liberties, they do things they shouldn't do, phone tapping, stuff that shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm all about honesty and integrity and openness, which, to be honest, Robyn, is one of the reasons I don't work for any of the national daily newspapers anymore, because I don't trust them. But again, people are intelligent enough to work out whether what they read in the Daily Mail is true or not.
Yeah.
You can kind of judge stuff by the way it's written. You can judge the agenda. The newspaper editors at some of these big papers have big agendas. They're not necessarily playing a straight bat. If I just rewind to what I said a little bit earlier on about how journalism is not up to pace with perhaps what social media is delivering, newspapers have tried to rather untidily catch up. And it's all about likes, isn't it? Look at the generation you've come through with the social media stuff. You put something up and someone likes it straight away. Isn't that wonderful?
Or they don't, and it makes you feel awful.
And it makes you feel awful. You've got that sort of instant gratification going on. So that's very addictive. As we know, as human beings, as creatures, that push for the like is very important. Well, of course, in a commercial environment, in a place where you're trying to physically sell newspapers, get clicks, you're going to put stuff up, clickbait, that's going to get those likes, that's going to generate stuff. Surely that's not the right way to go, because you're then kind of putting a spin on a story which shouldn't be there, because simply put, you're just trying to get people liking it. So that's, I think, one of the biggest battles that you can face in a journalistic environment if you're trying to retain that integrity that we've talked about already. If you go down that route, I think the battle is lost. Fortunately, not every single newspaper is like that. And, I think they all have their moments.
Yeah.
I'm not a political animal in any way, shape or form. I don't do politics. I just see people for people. I don't think everybody does it that way. Everyone's different. I certainly don't respect newspapers that go to one extreme or another. And I think the tabloids have done themselves no favours in lots of respects. Some of the broadsheets in a similar way. But they all have important roles to play in society. I think if you only had one newspaper that covered everything, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
I think when you've got a dozen that all do things slightly differently, then it's a more balanced view of the world.
And can I ask, do you actually think there is a newspaper right now in the UK that isn't either right-wing or left-wing? Do you think there is a neutral newspaper out there?
Not really.
No.
I mean, we're human beings. We're kind of... They're trying to sell commercial stuff. They're trying to make money. They're not doing it. It's not a charity that they're trying to sort of operate here. They're trying to, they sell advertising. They're trying to fill up column inches with interesting stuff to attract the readers that are going to pay the face value of the newspaper. So pure independence, of course, doesn't exist. But I think, again, you have to, I suppose, rely on your readers, your human population of your country to read between the lines a little bit. I suppose I'm in the fortunate position of being able to actually read between the lines. I do understand the way a story is constructed, and when it lacks balance, I instantly realise that it should be better, a job that should be better done. if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But then I recall having lots of conversations with different people throughout my life about the papers they read or the news they consume, and they're very unwilling to stop reading, say, for example, The Sun, or, and I just, do you think there's a concern because not everyone is reading through the lines? Like, a lot of people are just taking it at face value and being like, oh, well, that's true, and actually it's not. Or
you see that the craziest thing of all is, in our pockets we have these.
Yeah.
This is the most powerful both media gathering device and media consumption device that has ever existed. It's been here 5 minutes, really, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Really, in terms of kind of the way things work, that is really 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
iPhone, when did that turn up? I mean, I can't remember when I got my first one, but not that long ago.
No.
So we as creatures are learning how to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah.
And eventually we'll get to the stage of going, I know I've been doing this for 20 years, but you know what? I don't think I trust it, actually. So let's go and do something else.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I hadn't really thought of it like that, in the sense that it is all still fairly new.
Yeah.
And while some generations maybe are growing up with it from day one, a lot of people haven't.
But people don't use it for the potential that it has. This is a library into the world.
Yeah.
So if something pops up on, Times Online or something, and I read it, I think, I wonder if that's correct or not. The first thing I do is start to have a Google. I have a little, not that Google's the be-all and end-all either.
Fact-checking for yourself.
Fact-checking for myself,
Yeah.
because I'm interested and invested in stuff. If I've taken the time to read something and I'm interested in it, I will take the time to read around the subject, and I'll find out my own information. So I know people don't do that, and yes, there is a concern that people will take things on face value. Of course, that's the case.
Yeah, and I feel like with Twitter, now X, there's been lots of different controversies over the years, really, with, what people are posting on there and also the information that they're taking from that. Because, you see some content online that would claim to be journalism, but obviously, as we know, it's not. And it's vicious, and maybe it's, even turning people against others, causing hatred. How can we keep people safe from that?
Leave.
So
I'll say this to you. I joined Twitter in, I'm going to say 2009 or 10. I left before Christmas.
Did you?
I'm never going back.
Yeah.
I think it's dreadful. What Elon Musk has done to Twitter, now X, as you say, is an aberration. There's an interesting comparison with, and I'm not this old, by the way, but I'm talking about the Second World War here. If you talk about the sort of the information that was passed around during the war, the sort of the appalling sort of misinformation that was passed on, the propaganda that was used to deliver poor information to various different people by a megalomaniac.
Yeah.
That's what we've got now. That's big, isn't it? We've got a guy who's got power. He's got the potentially furthest reaching information distributing platform in the world. Is he actually using it for good? Or is he using it to butter his own toast? I think I know which the answer is.
I think I do too.
And I think, again, you have to trust people to kind of make their own judgment. Sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea and the dog and, just kind of seeing the world go by on your phone. And eventually you just get to the point of thinking, this is absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
This is unbalanced. It comes from somebody with a massive agenda. Look at some of the stuff that he said in the last few weeks about the Prime Minister, about the way our country's run. He's got opinions. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. No problem at all. People can say anything about anything they like. But don't portray it as fact. Don't portray it as an absolute, because that's what I think that sounds like a dictator to me.
So when you were saying about social media, free speech, having a place to say what you feel, I remember when I first got Facebook, I think it said something like, how are you feeling in the little status box. And at that time, platforms like Facebook definitely weren't being used for journalism or to share news. It was very personal and it was very individual, and it was people literally posting about their holidays, and obviously that still happens. But now we are inundated with lots of different sources of news. But I guess what I felt while you were talking about this just now is so many people I've spoke to recently have left Twitter. Almost everyone I know has come off X. I can't stop calling it Twitter, sorry. And that gives me hope. And like you said, you're scrolling through and you're thinking, this is nonsense. So actually, maybe we safeguard ourselves. We check ourselves when we're scrolling through this content. I guess it just leaves me with a bit. So on one side, I'm hopeful. On the other side, I'm concerned for the people that maybe don't have the ability to be like, no, that's not right. But that's a much larger conversation.
I understand. So let's rewind. And you're talking about village gossips here. Because, the lady in number 27 might say something about somebody, and the 15 other people who live in the village either choose to believe what she says or they don't.
Yeah.
Okay?
Absolutely.
Just because it's on Twitter and it's 15 million people, not 15, there's no real material difference in that. Humans are, by their very nature, gossips. We want to find out what other people are doing, what they're saying, what they're dressed in. It's just the way that's how we're wired, isn't it? And unfortunately, as a result of that, we make judgments about other people based on their appearance, their, goodness knows what various different definitions we have of those. That has never actually changed. The cavemen were probably doing that. I'm assuming, again, not that old. But the fact we can now see it on social media, I think the problem is that the instant nature of it, the fact that you can hide behind a username which is not your own, so there's an anonymity, which is a very negative thing. I don't think that's helpful. And I think people will eventually get to the stage of sussing all of this stuff out.
People are almost like, you know what, I'm not going to use Facebook, I'm not going to use X, I'm just going to have Instagram, and I'm going to set a 15-minute timer, and I'm not going to take my news from there. I'm going to download the BBC News app, and that's what I'm going to use that for.
Okay, so let's look at this a slightly different way as well. One of the things I think people are also waking up to, probably in the last 2 years, is that what comes on your news feed is not generated by a human being. Algorithms decide what comes onto your phone. If I've got a spaniel, okay? If you should search for, let's say, my wife is very keen on buying new dog beds. If she does an internet search for a dog bed, how many dog bed adverts do I get on my Facebook, Instagram, when I was on X? But the thing is, the same stuff that's used to sell you a dog bed is then used to sell you a piece of information, sell in inverted commas, to give you that piece of information. So if you go down a rabbit hole where you start looking at racist attacks in Bradford, suddenly you'll get lots of things about all sorts of different things to do with racism. It's all polarised into a feed that's been controlled by an algorithm which has been designed by somebody to sell you things. And I think people are starting to understand that now, whereas 2 or 3 years ago they didn't, and the algorithms certainly weren't as sophisticated as they are now. I know there's an awful lot of legislation required to try to control this sort of stuff. When and where that will come, I don't know, because the people that write it, the people that are responsible for it, certainly don't want it to finish because it's made them very rich.
Yeah. So with that in mind then, a safer way of receiving balanced news, if there is such a thing, would be on the radio, in the evening, on the television, or in the morning, however, whatever time you like to watch the news, then actually accessing it on a phone. I
think what you've got to do is, if you're interested enough in a subject to be invested in it, just read around it as much as you can from as many different places as you can. There's no one news organisation that gets everything right, never has been, never will be. And I think you've just got to kind of trust yourself, trust your own judgment, to read around things as much as you can, to research things. And, it's easy for me to say because I've been doing it for so long. But you just think that doesn't sound... If you think something doesn't sound quite right, check it.
Yeah.
That's the simple way to do it. Check it. And if you're not sure and you read around it and you find that actually it's not right, then you know whether to trust that organisation or that journalist again, don't you?
And perhaps don't put too much stock in it.
Yeah. Potentially. The other thing is types of news that are delivered to you. First of all, anything that's got to do with politics, can you believe it? And it's a sales pitch, isn't it? It seems to be headlines in certainly the BBC ITV all the time. I don't count that as proper news. I think it should be in its own programme somewhere else. News is news. News is fires in LA.
Yeah.
It's nasty stuff like that. So everybody's entitled to their opinion about absolutely everything, but that is not news.
No, there's a difference.
There's a big difference.
There's a big difference.
But the lines have been blurred so much because the second you publish something, here's a post which says this, someone will read it and think it's true.
Yeah.
And then that person will take it to another thing and they'll publish it and they'll think it's true. So it becomes something else. That's a really dangerous place to be.
Everything you said there is really interesting, and it's also, to be honest, concerning. And I think about my nephew. He's 9.
All right.
Yeah, and he is growing up in a world where social media and news online has been there from the day of his birth, And he's going to be going to secondary school in a couple of years, and I see young people of that age walking around with phones and maybe taking everything that they read as truth. How can we protect that generation, do you think, in terms of making sure they're aware of what is journalism and what is a contribution from an everyday person? Is it education in schools? Is it, I don't know, is it even, content warnings to say this is not journalism? You know how people have to say now this is an ad on their social media. Is there something in that for news that's not actually by a journalist or a news outlet?
I think the danger of saying put warnings on everything, I don't know if this is just me, if a button says do not press this button, the first thing I do is go to press the button. Do not read this content, I want to see what it is. So I think the curiosity side of it is an interesting thing that you've got to solve. I think legislation or certainly moderation is needed, because if you look at things like Donald Trump's first campaign as president, the whole fake news thing was just the biggest genius move that anybody's ever come up with. Because if you put 5,000 bits of fake news out and 5,001 is true, and nobody believes the previous 5,000, are they going to believe the 5,001st? No, they're not. And you don't look at it. And I think that's an amazingly dangerous place to be. And I think, so going around in a big circle to what you said about your 9-year-old nephew, he's going to get to the point of saying, I'm really not interested in any of this at all, and go and do something completely different.
Yeah.
So news will become something that's completely alien to him. But telling people when someone's crossed the line they shouldn't be allowed to cross is a really important role that journalists should be playing. You shouldn't be allowed to get away with stuff. That's what our job should be about. So if people switch off from news completely, people who do dodgy things will get away with it. I think what needs to happen, I suppose, is we need to teach people to do the job that a journalist does better, so that people understand what role they play, what responsibilities they have to both themselves, to their own integrity, their own honesty, their own way of doing things, the audience that they're serving, and the way that news and information is delivered is a really crucial part of that. People need to understand the responsibility they have.
Yeah, and then we could hopefully see a more trustworthy future for journalism.
Yeah, I just go back to be your own person and use your own judgment and trust what you think is trustworthy and be sceptical. If you should always go into something sceptical, with a sceptical viewpoint, I think. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think, you need to be open to the fact that what you're reading is not correct.
Yeah.
Just because it appears in front of you doesn't mean it's right. Question everything.
Yeah.
Some things more than others, but certainly anything with a political slant, ask yourself, what's the agenda of the person who's telling me that?
Yeah, and I do think the wonderful thing about humans is that we are curious and we do question.
Yeah.
So I do feel confident, and I hope you do too, that actually the future is bright for sort of balanced journalism and renewed integrity.
I think my job as a journalism lecturer, which is aside to all the stuff that I write and broadcast and all the rest of it, I'm passionately committed to teaching people the importance of balance, the importance of seeing two sides of every story. We're starting a new journalism degree at Solent in 2026. One of the things that we will be instilling in that is the commitment to be honest. Journalism has got a bad rap. So have estate agents. You know, people think we're awful people.
Ticket wardens.
Traffic wardens, terrible people. But ultimately, I think people need to understand the role that we play in a functioning, decent society is to just hold up a torch to people and say, you're doing that properly. Should you be doing it that way?
Yeah.
One of the jobs that I've done in my career, I was news editor at ITV Meridian. So I would answer the phone when somebody phoned up and said, this terrible thing has happened to me. These awful people at the local council, hospital, whatever, have done this and it's not fair. And what do I do? And I don't know who to turn to for help. And what you'd find out as you dug into that story was that the organisation that this person was talking about had done something they shouldn't have done. They'd been, obsessed with their admin at the expense of a human being on the other end of the phone. Somebody had suffered as a result of somebody doing their job badly. And when we tended to aim the cameras at them, everything fell apart and everything was sorted out.
Yeah.
I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of answering those phones and saying, let me look into that for you. Now, that's our job as journalists, is to shine those lights on people that do things wrong. So if people do bad things, they should be slightly fearful that they're going to be exposed, that they've done something wrong.
If audience trust in institutions has been eroded, so, the newspapers or the BBC, for example, when you've got an important story, how do you make the truth stand out from all of that noise and that sense of distrust?
I think the key here is truth. And I'm a great believer in the truth will out. It might not happen instantly. It might take 5 years, but eventually the truth will come out. And that's one of the important roles that good journalists play. There might be a lot of noise. There might be a lot of bluster. There might be one person telling a story that is true and 20 others that aren't. But eventually the noise dies down and people will understand and people will eventually find out the truth. And if you've got good people writing about this sort of stuff or broadcasting it, eventually there will. It might take something that starts as a news story 1 year, 10 years, 5 years down the line, it might become a documentary that somebody who's passionate about it thinks, no, that was not true, and I'm going to find out what happened. Eventually, the truth will out.
Absolutely, and that is such an amazing thing. Like you said, people say, I'm going to the media then, and that does put the fear in people.
Not as much as it used to.
No, but like you said, stuff gets done.
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful tool of journalism. So I think that's a really positive note to end on, actually. I feel good about the future. Thanks.
You're welcome.
You so much for being here.
Great to speak to you. Thanks for having me.
It's been great. Thank you. Big thanks to Andy for joining us on this week's episode of Explained. And thank you, listener, for tuning in. Like what you heard today? Let us know. You can find us online at solent.ac.uk, as well as on all your favourite social media platforms. Thank you, and see you soon.